Okay, 2 disclaimers before we get started tonight. Disclaimer number 1, I'm going to say a lot of things tonight that you might find a hard time believing. And unfortunately, because of our time constraints, I can't stop and show my work all the time like you have to do in mathematics. But what I will do is I will provide the resources I use to gather this material. So if anything I say tonight, occasionally I'll say you'll just have to trust me on that, and that's one of those things. If anything that I say sparks I want to know more about that, then let me know. Again, send me an email, unless for Janice you can't send me an email, but everybody else send me an email, and I'll send you links. In one case, a book, a really good book, that will go through in much more detail what I'm going to talk about tonight. But for the purposes of tonight, I'm going to say a couple things, and I may briefly offer some proofs, but for the most part, for the purposes, I'm not asking you to trust me implicitly. I'm asking you to trust me for the purposes of our conversation today. And then after that, if it's really going to make a difference to you, I encourage you to go deeper into the study. One of the guys I'm taking a lot of this material from did this material in 5 weeks. And so obviously I'm not going to spend 5 weeks on this. I don't think even you would enjoy spending 5 weeks on this, but I think the material is really good, and so I do want to cover it. But there are some things where I'm just going to have to say you're going to have to take me on faith for tonight, and then I'm not saying that you do that forever, just until you can get the additional resources from me that hold me accountable to what I taught. As Dale pointed out, I made at least one mistake last week or maybe clarification of something I should have made more clear. Second thing is, we're going to start tonight. It looks like we're going to start in Daniel, but actually we're going to start all the way back in Exodus tonight. There's going to be a long build-up towards where I want to go tonight, and I'm doing it on purpose for 2 reasons. First of all, I think it's key to understanding what we're going to look at tonight, and to solidify at least one of the things I'm going to say. You have to take it by faith. If you understand why I'm doing the build-up, you'll understand that it should help at least one of the things I say tonight by faith to make more sense to you. Secondly, I believe that the reason why that there's a lot of people who I believe teach incorrect views about the end times, they do so because they ignore the Old Testament to their peril. I mentioned last week how I thought there are churches nowadays that actually teach that the Old Testament isn't really relevant, and that everything in the Old Testament that is relevant to us was repeated in the New Testament. So studying the New Testament should be good enough for most Christians. And I really think that the reason why a lot of people get prophecy wrong is because they refuse to acknowledge the fact that our New Testament apostles and the writers of the New Testament, their influences from the Old Testament are what caused them to assume some amount of knowledge on the reader's behalf that we don't necessarily get. So I think things were better understood that were written in the New Testament by the early church people because they had the benefit of knowledge of the Old Testament. And I think a lot of people nowadays don't understand as much of the New Testament because they don't have that background.
I didn't understand a lot of the New Testament until I read the Old Testament.
Right. So you get that richness, and you get that. It's like getting a movie in black and white, and then the Old Testament provides the color for the picture. And when you think about Jesus, and so many things that Jesus said were based on, he would quote Old Testament prophets and writings, and he would make references to them. And sometimes when he's not quoting them specifically, you lose the fact that he's making a reference to something in the Old Testament when he's trying to teach a principle in the New Testament. And so because of that, we're going to start a little bit far back, and it may, like 20 minutes from now, you're going to be wondering, what are we doing this again? And then hopefully towards the latter half of the middle of the class, things should start clicking. And then hopefully it'll help us have a better sense of what we're going to look at tonight, which is this prophecy that's only 3 verses long. Hi, come on in. So it's a prophecy that's only 3 verses long, but but it really is the outline on which the New Testament prophecies overlay. So, and that's something I really didn't understand even as far back as a couple years ago when Matt and I would have discussions about why we think the tribulation will last 7 years. And it didn't really make sense that the only reason we would think that would be Daniel's prophecy, because it's like, well, why just there? Why wouldn't it be elsewhere too? But if you understand that the Apostle Paul and John and Peter and even Jesus, when they were referencing end times, they were thinking about the prophecies in the Old Testament like the prophecy of Daniel. And what we see that in Matthew chapter 24 when Jesus specifically quotes Daniel's prophecy when talking about something that's going to happen in the middle of the tribulation, which we'll be looking at next week. So I think that's enough preamble. Let's jump right into it. Oops. Ignore that. So here this I showed you at the beginning of last week's class. And it's basically the Old Testament period. As I said before, ignore the dates, they're terrible numbers. But what I like about it is it does show the difference. And where we're going to start today is all the way here, but we're going to spend a lot of time right here. So that's about somewhere between 700 and 800 years. And so we're going to see a prophecy being fulfilled in the Old Testament, that a prophecy that occurred in the Old Testament and was fulfilled in the Old Testament, but the gap was between 700 and 800 years of that fulfillment, which again, when you see fulfilled prophecy in the scripture, it should help build confidence in what the future prophecies and how they're going to be fulfilled. So I wanted to get a sense of that. So real briefly, Exodus, obviously Moses, the giving of the law. We go through the conquest is the nation of Israel moving into the land, the period of the judges, the period of kings. We had Saul first, then David and Solomon, and then eventually the division of the kingdom where they split into Judah and Israel. Israel got taken over due to the fact that they were continually rebelling against God, so God finally sent the Assyrians to wipe them out. And then the southern kingdom, Judah, had some good kings and some bad kings, so they lasted a little bit longer. But eventually, judgment caught up to them. And we're going to look at specifically why that judgment occurred and why they ended up in this Babylonian exile and where we find Daniel in. So this is sort of a setup to where we're going tonight. So let's start in the book of Exodus. Let's start with So God has a standard and that he revealed it. His promised land must enjoy rest. So this is our first point we're going to look at tonight, is that when he gave his law, he told the Israelites, you're going to go into your land. And when you do, you need to give it, every 7 years, you need to give it a year off. And so modern day, we would call this crop rotation. People, if they're familiar with farming procedures, you allow the land to rest so it can build back up its nutrient stuff. If you continue to use soil, it will lose all its nutrients. So that's a principle that we're familiar with here. But it was something that God ordained to his people, say, hey, you need to give the land a rest. So let's look what he said. Oh, and I said Exodus, it's in Leviticus, sorry. While Moses was on Mount Sinai, the Lord said to him, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you have entered the land I am giving you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath rest before the Lord every seventh year. For 6 years you may plant your fields and prune your vineyards and harvest your crops, but during the 7th year the land must have a Sabbath year of complete rest. It is the Lord's Sabbath. Do not plant your fields or prune your vineyards during that year. And don't store away the crops that grow on their own or gather the grapes for your unpruned vines. The land must have a year of complete rest. So God set a standard up, and this was what his expectation was. And then he also, as well as setting up a standard, he revealed his punishment. If Israel doesn't allow the land to rest, God will. And so we see this, and further along in Leviticus, he says regarding Israel, I will scatter you among the nations and bring out my sword against you. Your land will become desolate and your cities will lie in ruins. Then at last the land will enjoy its neglected Sabbath years as it lies desolate while you are in exile in the land of your enemies. Then the land will finally rest and enjoy the Sabbaths it missed. So, as long as the land lies in ruins, it will enjoy the rest you never allowed it to take every seven years while you lived in it. So here is God's standard, and he reveals his judgment. And really it's a prophecy that Israel is going to fail to live up to this specific command. And he's pronouncing a future judgment based on these on this principle. So now we're going to move ahead a little bit to the time right before the nation, the kingdom of Judah was going to be destroyed. The prophet Jeremiah warned the fact that they hadn't been keeping their promise, they hadn't been keeping God's standard regarding the land. And so we see this in Jeremiah. This is what the Lord says: you will be in Babylon for 70 years, but then I will come along and do for you all the good things I have promised, and I will bring you home again. So there's two parts to this verse, and I think it's important for us to remember both. First of all, this is pre the kingdom of Judah falling. It says, the Lord says, hey, because of your disobedience, you're going to be in exile for 70 years. But at the end of the 70 years, I'm going to bring you home again. So there's both a promise of judgment and a promise of restoration within that. And so 70 years is an important number, and we're going to look at that a little bit. So we find that God's judgment is going to fall as Israel is led into exile. And this is from 2 Chronicles. So the Lord brought the king of Babylon against them. The Babylonians killed Judah's young men, even chasing after them into the temple. They had no pity on the people, killing both young men and young women, the old and the infirm. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. The king took home to Babylon all the articles, large and small, used in the temple of God, and the treasures from both the Lord's temple and from the palace of the king and his officials. Then the army burned the temple of God, tore down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all the palaces, and completely destroyed everything of value. The few who survived were taken as exiles into Babylon, and they became servants to the king and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. One of those persons taken into exile was Daniel. So the message of the Lord spoke through Jeremiah was fulfilled. The land finally enjoyed its Sabbath rest, lying desolate until the 70 years were fulfilled, just as the prophet had said. So the prophet being Jeremiah, and Jeremiah referring way back to the prophecy in Leviticus. And so you see here 70 years was going to be their exile. And if we do a little quick math, if the land was supposed to rest every 70 year or every 7th year, and there were 70 years total for the judgment, that meant that 70 times 7, they had skipped in some 490 year period, they had skipped allowing the land to rest. And so God said, okay, I'm going to bring the rest to the land that I promised and they wouldn't fulfill. So is there any questions on all of that?
I think maybe God used 70 years also because the ones he would bring back into Judah would not be of the generation that desolated the land.
I can't answer that question, but I do think that the fact that it's 70 has a direct result to how long they were disobedient in this way. Now, if God had preordained that they were going to be disobedient for 70 years for some specific reason, possibly. We certainly saw that. I know what you're thinking. This is an allusion back to when they were wandering in the desert, right?
Right.
And God wanted to make sure that he cleaned out the generation of unfaithful people and started fresh again.
Right.
So that's possible. So why 70 years? God stated that the punishment was directly a result of disobedience regarding the land's rest. So we saw that in 2 Chronicles, that specifically the exile was due to them disobeying God's standard. The punishment for this disobedience was 70 years in exile. Since the land was to rest every 7 years, 70 times 7 years of disobedience was in view. So, and this is important. The 70 times 7 is important to where we're going. So that's sort of the backdrop to where we're going to start today, which is the end of the judgment. So we've seen all that. We've seen the exile. We've seen the setup to this prophecy of 70 years. And now we're going to look towards the end of it. So we're going to start with Daniel becoming aware of the 70-year judgment. So this is something, obviously, he wasn't aware of before. And we're going to start in Daniel chapter 9, verse 1. It was the first year of the reign of Darius the Mede, the son of something, who became king of the Babylonians. During the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, learned from reading the word of the Lord, as revealed to Jeremiah the prophet, that Jerusalem must lie desolate for 70 years. So here we see Daniel reading the book of Jeremiah. And so it's sort of cool that, that we can go back and actually look at what Daniel was reading at that point. So Daniel's reaction to finding this out, he turned to the Lord and pleaded with him in prayer and fasting. I also wore rough burlap and sprinkled myself with ashes. So this is a way of that the people in Daniel's day used to show that they were in extreme remorse and repentance. And so we're going to skip over between in verse 4 to I think verse 20 is a really long, sincere prayer. It's called one of the great prayers of the Old Testament, where Daniel really just confesses his nation's disobedience and prays for the restoration of his people and his city, Jerusalem. Okay. So I should have reviewed these a little bit closer to this tonight. In the 67th year of the exile, Daniel was reading Jeremiah's prophecy and discovered that the exile was almost over. So this was 67 years into the 70 years. He immediately started praying for God's forgiveness and mercy on his people, the Jews, and on his capital, Jerusalem. Daniel believed that perhaps the restoration of Israel would coincide with the kingdom coming. So if we remember back to Jeremiah, he talked about not only that the exile was going to happen, but that God would bring them back and restore them back to the land. And I think Daniel was of the thought that the prophecies of the Old Testament that talked about the Messiah coming and setting up his kingdom in Israel was going to happen as the nation was restored back into Israel. Because part of his prayer and some of the other things he wrote suggested that was on his mind when he went to the Lord in prayer about this. And then the cool thing is we get to see God send an answer to Daniel's prayer, and probably in a way that a lot of us would like to see our own prayers answered by. So Daniel chapter 9, verse 21. As I was praying, Gabriel, who I had seen in the earlier vision, came swiftly to me at the time of the evening sacrifice. He explained to me, Daniel, I have come here to give you insight and understanding. The moment you began praying, a command was given, and now I'm here to tell you what it was, for you are very precious to God. Listen carefully so that you can understand the meaning of your vision. So Gabriel, the same angel that gave the good news to Mary about the birth of Jesus, we see here in the Old Testament giving good news to Daniel. And so these 3 or 4 verses we're about to look at tonight are the prophecy that's commonly called Daniel's 70 weeks. So we'll start off with the first verse of the 4 verses. A period of 70 sets of 7 have been decreed for your people in your holy city to finish their rebellion, to put an end to their sin, to atone for their guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to confirm the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy place. So we see a prophecy here that's going to run for a period of 70, and most verses, or most translations will have the word weeks here, 70 weeks. So that, again, when you say Daniel 70 weeks, that's usually, so I happened to pick a translation that didn't use that. So this phrase 70 sets of seven, or so sets of seven is a specific word in Hebrew that it's similar to, in English, our word dozen, where we can talk about a dozen of something and it just means a known amount of a group of something. A dozen roses, a dozen donuts, a dozen eggs. So we understand that concept. Well, literally the word in Hebrew just means seven. So it's really, reading this literally would be a period of 70 sevens. And so the question becomes, is what does this mean by sevens? What is meant here? It's obviously a time period because it mentions a period. And so we have to decide what it means. So this is the first time I'm going to use that little card I talked about at the beginning of the class and say, for what we're going to talk about tonight, you need to understand that this set of seven means years. So set of 7 years. So a set of seven is a set of 7 years. Now I'll show my work. If you ask me, I will send you the work. But it would take too long to explain. But what I will point out is that Daniel started this whole vision or this whole series of events by looking at a prophecy that was talking about a 490-year period. And so Daniel was at the end of this period looking and saying, is this it? Is this when all your promises that you promised to the Jewish people going to be fulfilled? And God is coming back and saying, no, not that 490-year period, but here is a 490-year period in which we are going to look at. And at the end of that period, then all of these things are going to come about. So again, I'm just going to play that card right now. Trust me for now that it's a set of a set of 7 years. So 70 sets of 7 years. We're going to see a little bit further how another way that can be proven to be years rather than anything else. But it's important to understand that as we move forward. The next part here is to notice that this prophecy is specific. This isn't for the Crossroads Church. This isn't for the people of America. This prophecy is specifically for your people, and he's talking to Daniel. So it's for the Jewish people and Daniel's holy city, which we understand to be Jerusalem. If you don't get that, then the prayer that I skipped over between verses 4 and 20, all he's doing is praying about his people and how they rebelled against God, and God was just in his punishment, and he prayed for restoration of his people and for the city of Jerusalem. So that for time purposes, we needed to skip that, but it's important to understand that this prophecy is specifically for the Jewish people and the city of Jerusalem, and that will become important as we go along into it.
So is this happening like 490 years before the resurrection?
You're getting ahead of me. Put the brakes on. I'll get there. But note what's going to happen here at the end of this prophecy. At the end of this prophecy, the Jewish people's rebellion against God will be fulfilled. Or will be finished, rather. It will no longer happen. And they will put an end to their sin, again, probably referring to their rebellion against God, to atone for their guilt, coming to a saving faith in Jesus Christ, likely, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to confirm the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy place. This is referring to the temple, to confirm the prophetic vision, and to confirm the prophetic vision means that all prophecy will be fulfilled or in a state of fulfillment at the end of this, or in a stage to be fulfilled at the end of this prophecy. And to bring in everlasting righteousness, I think we can all agree that hasn't taken place yet. But it is promised in Isaiah 9. And this verse is going to sound very familiar to you. The first verse. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders. And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. and on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. So the establishment of righteousness forevermore, according to Isaiah's prophecy, will take place when Jesus comes back and sets up his kingdom. So from that, we can go back to this prophecy and understand that at the end of this prophecy, we should see Jesus Christ coming back to set up his kingdom. That's the only way. Come on in. That's the only way we're going to see this prophecy fulfilled, is if Jesus Christ sets up his kingdom, because that's the only way that everlasting righteousness can exist, is once God puts the end to the way that man is running this world, and he sets up his own kingdom. So this is the sort of outline of the prophecy here. We've got 70 weeks of 7. We've got a time period. We've got a target for the prophecy, which is the Jewish people and Jerusalem. And we've got the end results of the prophecy, which is a lot of really good things. The Jewish people basically coming back to a spiritual knowledge of Jesus Christ, or coming to us. They're not coming back. They're coming back to obedience to God by recognizing that Jesus was the Messiah that they've been looking for all along, and the establishment of Jesus's kingdom on earth, which will bring in that the beginning of that everlasting righteousness as far as his rule over us. So that's the outline of the prophecy. Now let's dig a little bit more into the details. I guess, are there any questions so far? There probably are a lot, but I'm hoping that some of what I'm going to go into next will.
So you didn't say what anoint the most holy place means.
This is about the temple. This is about fulfilling the purpose of the temple. We're not actually going to get into too much detail because it's not necessarily germane to where we're going. Although I think it's important to note the temple is a part of this vision or this prophecy because of what we're going to look at a little bit later. That's a good observation, though. Okay, skipping over that. So God is revealing his 490-year plan for the Jewish nation, Israel, and not the church. I think that's important to realize because I think a lot of people try to take that prophecy and misapply it to other people. And it's clear from the verse that it's specifically for the nation of Israel. At the end of this time period, Jesus will begin his kingdom on earth, which will last forever. Okay, so I guess those are the 2 points I had for this so far. Okay, so let's move to verse 25. Now listen and understand. 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7 will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem until a ruler, the anointed one, comes. Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses despite the perilous times. So let's take a look at this second verse in this prophecy. So 70 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7. Based on what we were just talking about, we would understand that to be 69 times 7 or 483 years. So we talked about a 490-year period for this prophecy, and 69 of the 70 weeks are going to be talked about right away. So we're going to just minus 7 from 490 and we get 483. So a lot of the first question I came up with when looking at this prophecy is why 7 years and 62 years? Why isn't it? There's 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7. Why is it broken up that way? There is no good agreement among the people I looked up that answer for to why that is. There's a lot of speculation. Some people think that the first 49 years, the 7 sets of 7, the first 49 years were the period in which the city of Jerusalem was rebuilt, and that in fulfillment of the previous verse that talked about it. Oh, never mind. It's in the next verse. Oh no, it's right there. Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses. So a lot of people believe that those first 7 years, the first 49 years of this prophecy were specifically for Jerusalem to get to the state where it had the strong defenses in place. Other people believe that was the 49 years was when the Old Testament canon ended. That 49 years after the start of this prophecy was when the last word of the Old Testament was inspired by God, and that brought to the end the Old Testament canon. So there isn't really a good answer that I can give you on what that why it distinguishes between 7 sets of 7 and 62 sets of 7. Fortunately for us, and where I want to go tonight, it's not that important. The important part is that that the first 483 years of this prophecy is about one specific thing, and then the next 7 is the second part of this prophecy. So after the first 483 years will pass, and so we're given a starting point. And the starting point of this prophecy, it wasn't immediately as soon as it was said. The prophecy didn't start at that point. It actually has a starting point that was further away than the immediate word. And that was when the command is given to rebuild Israel, or to rebuild Jerusalem. So this is the starting point of this prophecy. A command is going to go out to rebuild Jerusalem, and that's when this, picture a big stopwatch, and on the stopwatch is 490 years. And you push the start button when the command goes out. And Jerusalem will be rebuilt with streets and strong defenses despite the perilous times. This helps to identify exactly which command, because there were multiple commands that went out to rebuild parts of Israel. There was a command to rebuild the temple, and there was multiple commands to go rebuild the temple. And so this extra detail helps us to identify the specific command that went out. So we're going to jump over to Nehemiah real quick here, because this is really germane to what we're just talking about. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1. Early the following spring in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence. And then skipping forward a little bit, I replied, if it please so the king, the part I skipped was the king saying, hey, why are you so sad? And Nehemiah said, if it pleases the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant. Oh, and so Nehemiah says, I'm worried about the people in my country who are living there, but the city's in ruins. There's no walls. So I'm really worried about them. And so the king says, well, what can I do? And Nehemiah says, if it pleases the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. And please give me a letter addressed to somebody, the manager of the king's forest, instructing him to give me timber. I will need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress, for the city walls, and for a house for myself. And the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. So, going back to verse 1 here. So, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign, he was serving the king his wine. So, because of archaeological evidence, we know that this decree went out on March 5th, 444 BC. So again, this is one of those things where I'm going to say it now. I could have spent 20 minutes showing you all the work. Instead, if you want further proof, drop me a link or drop me an email, and I'll send you the material to research this for yourself. But for the purposes of what we're going to look at tonight, we know that this command went out on March 5th, 444 BC. The reason why we know this, I'll just tell you really briefly, is we know exactly when the predecessor Artaxerxes stepped away. He stepped away on December 31st of 445. And so I remember the December 31st, I don't remember the year. But we know that, because we know that year, we can know the month of Nisan is the second month in the Jewish calendar. And so we can do some date math and figure out when the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign started. So that's how we can be fairly accurate in when this date was. And further proof would come from extra material that I'm not going to provide tonight. But so going back to our prophecy that we were looking at, so we know when the prophecy was supposed to start, and then we see the conclusion of this 483 years is until a ruler, the anointed one, comes. And so this is talking, especially in hindsight, this is talking about the Messiah, the Israel's Messiah. And so basically this prophecy is saying 483 years after a decree comes out, you should expect to see the Messiah. And the cool thing is, if you do the math, that it comes out, that if you figure out, okay, so this is 483 years is 173,880 days. I forgot which charts I gave you. So if you look at the date, the decree of Artaxerxes, and this is the date that the person who researched this prophecy came upon, independent of this prophecy, for the triumphal entry of Jesus, the Palm Sunday, when he presented himself to the nation of Israel as the Messiah. That was a date that he came up with independently. And again, I'm going to show you the book. This author went through all of that and went through his justification for coming up with this date before he went into this exercise. So this guy, Harold Honer, he's a professor, or he used to be a professor, I don't know if he still is, at Dallas Theological Seminary. He has a double doctorate in Bible. So I'm not gonna call him dishonest or that he fudged the numbers to make it look good. But he shows his work in the book that he wrote, and it's pretty compelling evidence. Purposes for tonight is, if you trust what Harold Honer's math, then and more importantly, we trust what God has to say in the Bible, then what we find out is that exactly when Daniel projected the Messiah to come into Jerusalem was when he came into Jerusalem. I don't know. Okay, here's the book, Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ. This is a real cool book because it not only, he calculates and he goes through a lot of historical data and some common sense stuff to come up with the birth of the birth date of Jesus, the dates of his ministry, and then the date of his the final week of his ministry. And that was what the whole book was. And it wasn't until I got to the appendix that he went into this Daniel prophecy, and I was like, wow, this should have been the start of the book, not the end of the book. But it was really cool because it laid it all out. And I read this long before I ever thought about teaching the book of Daniel at prophecy. But it's really cool how the numbers really come out. Oh, and I didn't put it in there. I was looking for a verse in Luke. When Jesus was coming in his triumphal entry in Luke, he says something that it might be hard to understand unless you have this background. He says, so the Pharisees rebuked him for the people for cheering on Jesus and saying, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. And the Pharisees said, rebuke your disciples, rebuke your followers. And Jesus has said, if you would have known the day, this day, you would have been prepared already. I wish I would have done the verse, but he talks specifically about knowing the day. And if they would have understood Daniel's prophecy right, they would have known that this was the time that Jesus was to present himself as Messiah. And if you think about what you've read about him in the Gospels, Jesus is constantly telling people, he'll heal somebody and they'll say, you must be the Messiah, and he'll say, don't tell anybody. This isn't the time. And he's always telling people, don't reveal what you know about me because it's not time yet. And his time hadn't come. His time was he had to wait until the exact time of the fulfillment of the prophecy in order to fully reveal himself. The other thing is if you think about in the beginning of Luke, we have this picture of a couple people in the temple waiting for, there was this old prophetess who was waiting for the Messiah to come. Well, she knew she understood the prophecy, and she knew that in 30 something years, the Messiah is supposed to come. He should be getting ready to be born now. So it talks about her actively looking for the fulfillment of God's promises. Furthermore, if you think about, and I love this because there's a whole bunch of layers here, and I'm going really fast over that. I apologize because it's not really where I wanted to go with all this, but it's really cool for just to hear about it. If you think about the wise men who are coming from the east to see the baby Jesus, well, why were they coming? I mean, it talks about the star. We saw the star, and people have talked about the star and what it astrologically could have meant. But how would they even know to look for the star? What caused them? Well, so think about it. If you think about who Daniel was made the chief of the wise men of Babylon, and then later when the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire, he was still the head over them. And he was made that because he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, And so Nebuchadnezzar said, well, obviously you're wiser than anybody else, so you're the head of my guys. So all of this writing of Daniel is in the Babylonian library, as their readings. And so the Babylonian people knew the prophecies of Daniel better than the Jewish people knew. And so the Babylonians knew exactly when it was going to be time for the Messiah to be born. And that's why they headed out. They said, where is he? We know he's supposed to be here. And so there's all these cool layers upon this prophecy where things are happening in the New Testament because of this prophecy. And so as you dig into this, you start to see further and further how this book of Daniel really influenced what was happening in the gospel in the time of Jesus. Yes.
That in Luke is 19, verse 41.
Could you read it?
Yeah, it says, he drew near the city, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you and surround you and close you in on every side.
We're going to look at that verse later because the second part of that verse becomes germane as we look at what happened to the nation of Israel. But time check. I'm using my phone for something. I can't use it for my clock.
7:18.
7:18.
7:19.
19. Okay. So I think that's cool. The reason I want to teach all through that is I think it's really cool to see prophecy fulfilled in such an exact manner. Not only the prophecy in Exodus that talks about the exile of the Jewish nation, but also the prophecy of the first 483 years of Daniel that leads to the life of Jesus. And I think these are the kind of prophecies that are going to be when Israel finally returns to Christ during the tribulation. I really think God's going to take the veil off their eyes, and they're going to see, wait a second, this was prophesied and it was fulfilled. And if we would have understood the prophecy correctly, it's obvious that Jesus is the Messiah, just based solely upon this one thing. And I think their eyes are going to be open, and these are the kind of things that they're going to see that's going to cause the nation of Israel to come back to Jesus as their Messiah, or come to Jesus as their Messiah. So some conclusions from what we looked at so far. God's prophecies can be trusted. God's prophecies are fulfilled literally, and I think that's important because I think there's too many people that want to spiritualize and make prophecies symbolic. And I think it's important to see that God's promises are mostly fulfilled literally. And then third, if the first 483 years were fulfilled literally, then we should expect the last 7 years to be fulfilled literally as well. So that's the third point, is sort of the introduction to where we're going next. So we looked at verse 25, the first part of talked about the first 483 years. So we're coming back to Daniel 9, verse 26. Let me water up here. After this period of 62 sets of 7, so this will be, we talked about the first 7, then the 62 sets of 7. So now we're at the 69th, end of the 69th period of 7. The anointed one will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing, and a ruler will arise whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. The end will come with a flood, and war and its miseries are decreed from that time to the very end. So we see that as predicted and as we know occurred, the anointed one will be killed. So Messiah will come, and he's going to offer himself, but he's going to be rejected, and he's going to be. So I will say, I didn't cherry pick this verse out of the New Living Translation. I had been consistently using the NLT now. Not all of the translations are nearly as obvious when it talks about that. It's a lot of the King James and maybe even the Holman says that he'll be cut off. So I do think that this translation assumes a little bit too much. But I think what we can do is we can look back at what actually happened. When Jesus came into Jerusalem, he presented himself as Messiah. And then within the day, they were plotting to kill him and to get rid of him. And so he was rejected, and he was eventually killed. And it appears, that was it. That Satan won his contest against Jesus. Jesus came back to be the Messiah, but Satan made sure to influence people so he could be killed. And so it appeared like at the end of that time, nothing good happened, especially for the nation of Israel. Remember, this prophecy is not for the church. We know all kinds of good things happen, but from the nation of Israel's perspective, a Messiah came, and he was supposed to overthrow the Romans. That Jewish people were looking for, not for somebody to wash away their sins. They were looking for a revolutionary leader that would come, overthrow the Romans, reset up the nation of the kingdom of Israel. Because remember, when the Jewish people went back to Jerusalem, they didn't go back to set up a kingdom. They weren't setting up a new king and starting their independent rule. From that point forward, from the fall of the kingdom that we looked at pre-Babylonian exile, from that point forward, they were a territory in somebody else's kingdom. They were never an independent kingdom with their own rulers. They were always underneath somebody else's rule. It was first the Babylonian, then the Persians. Well, actually, I think they by the time they were restored, the Babylonian Empire was already overthrown. It was the Persians, the Greek, and then eventually the Roman Empire. And so the Jewish people were looking for a revolutionary to come and overthrow the people that were oppressing them, and for a person to sit on David's throne again and rule as king from Jerusalem. And so that's the kind of Messiah they were looking for. So when Jesus was killed, from a Jewish perspective, they were looking for a king, and he wasn't it. And so it looked like nothing was accomplished at that point. And then this next part talks about a ruler will arise whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. The end will come with a flood, and war and its miseries are decreed from that time to the very end. So we know that shortly after this, a period after maybe, depending on what dates you go with, say 35 years or so, the Romans came due to some rebellion on the Jewish people's part, and they destroyed the city of Jerusalem. It was completely wiped out. As a matter of fact, if you remember, Jesus at one point was talking about the temple, and he said, "Not one stone will be left on top of another," and that literally was true. And the reason why was because the gold, the city caught on fire, and the gold that was in the temple liquefied and ran into the ruts of the wall. And then the soldiers, the way soldiers are paid often is they're paid very modest wages, but they get to keep loot, bounty from whoever they're conquering. And so to the soldiers, that gold that was melting and running into the cracks of the walls, that was their compensation. And so literally they tore the walls of Jerusalem, and especially the temple area, apart because they wanted that gold. And so when Jesus said that the temple, not one stone will be left on another as far as the temple was concerned, it was literally because that's what the Romans did. Is they literally came in, and because the city had caught fire, they had to, in order to put out the fire, they had to send in a bunch of water to put out the fire. So this literally was fulfilled about 35 years after Jesus' death, as Jerusalem was wiped out, and the nation of, well, the group of Israelites that lived there at that time were scattered. Now, some of them weren't completely scattered, and there later, in about 135 AD, there was another rebellion where the remnants of the people that sort of stuck around in that area were finally dealt with again, because Jewish people. Oops, see, I told you I was going to do that. I won my bet. And
Who did you bet?
Hey,
myself.